The laughter was a monster. It clawed at the walls of the great hall, a joyous, terrible thing that made Arya's skin feel too tight for her bones. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows of a stone alcove. Her only goal, her only prayer, was to become invisible, to simply disappear. Every toast felt like a shovel of dirt on her own grave, because this was supposed to be her night, her life. Instead, her eyes kept betraying her, snapping back to the high table, to Cale. His smile was a weapon, sharp and bright, and it wasn't aimed at her. It was for Lyra, her sister. Lyra was a star drenched in moonlight, her silver gown shimmering as she rested a hand on Cale's arm. They were perfect, a perfect lie that had cost Arya everything. That's why a cold, heavy stone sat in her chest, making it hard to breathe. All those promises Cale had whispered to her since they were kids. All of it was just smoke. Gone the second Lyra decided she wanted him. Just breathe, Arya. Don't you dare let them see you cry. But the tears were coming anyway, hot and angry. The chill from the stone wall was the only thing that felt real, a sharp contrast to the fire of shame burning in her cheeks. She could feel the stares of her pack, their pity like a physical touch she wanted to shrug off. She was the broken thing at the feast, the girl who wasn't chosen. With every heartbeat, the shame grew hotter. She chanced one more look, a self-destructive little habit, her gaze sliding past the happy couple and up to the highest throne, the Alpha King, Lucian Thorne. He sat alone, a king carved from winter ice and fury. He wasn't watching the party. He was watching his prisoners. And then it happened. In the span of a breath, his eyes, cold, empty, and terrifying, locked onto hers. There was no kindness there, no pity. It was like being seen by a hurricane. In that moment, terror stole her breath, and she knew, deep down, she knew the truth. This night was about to get so much worse.
This entire ceremony was a tedious, pointless affair. Lucian sat on his throne of carved obsidian and watched the lesser wolves celebrate their crude alliances. His only goal was to get through it, to maintain the mask of absolute control that kept his kingdom from tearing itself apart, and then to escape to the blessed quiet of his own mind. For 10 years, that quiet had been his only comfort. The wolf inside him, the roaring, instinctual beast that was his birthright, had fallen silent after the great tragedy, and he was grateful for it, because emotion was a disease, a weakness that could cost you everything. He'd learned that lesson in Blood and Fire. His councilmen muttered about trade and treaties at his feet. He saw the wolves below not as people, but as pieces on a game board. Kyle, the beta heir, had made a smart move marrying the ambitious Vale sister. Lucien filed the information away and felt nothing. Nothing at all. His gaze swept the room, a bored king taking inventory, until it stopped. In a dark corner, a lone she-wolf was practically drowning in her own sadness. It rolled off her in waves, a bitter scent on the air that was annoying. Another messy, untamed emotion cluttering his perfectly ordered world. He was about to look away, to dismiss her entirely. But then, something deep in his chest, a thing that had been dead and buried for a decade, began to stir. It wasn't a thought. It was a feeling. A low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through his very bones. It was so foreign, so unwelcome, that his hand clenched on the arm of his throne, the stone biting into his palm. What was this? He looked at the girl again, at the single tear that slipped down her cheek. The rumble grew louder, a possessive, primal growl coiling in his gut. A crack had just formed in the ice of his soul, and it had a name he didn't even know yet.
A shadow fell over her, and the sweet, cloying scent of Lyra's perfume choked the air. There you are. Lyra's voice was like honey, but Arya knew it was laced with poison. We were so worried about you. She stood there, glowing and triumphant, with Cale hovering behind her like a guilty ghost. He wouldn't look at Arya. Of course he wouldn't. But Lyra's eyes drank in every detail of Arya's crumpled dress and tear-stained face. "It's a lovely night, isn't it?" Lyra said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "I know this has to be hard, but some bonds, well, they're just meant for more. For greatness." She touched Kale's chest, a gesture of pure ownership. "And some just aren't." The words were daggers, each one twisted with a cruel little smile. Arya's only goal now was to survive this, not to give her sister the satisfaction of seeing her shatter. She lifted her chin, her voice tight. "I'm happy for you both." Lyra's smile was a thing of indulgent condescension. "Of course you are. It's for the best, really. Kyle needs a strong mate, someone who isn't afraid of the light." She leaned closer, her voice a venomous whisper. "Don't you worry, little sister. Maybe a border patrol wolf will have you. You just have to learn your place in the shadows." And that was it. The final blow. The last of Arya's control crumbled into dust. A single hot tear of pure rage and defeat escaped, and in the dim light she saw the flash of victory in Lyra's eyes. She had won. But then, Lyra's face changed. Her smug smile froze. Her eyes widened in shock, maybe even fear. Without warning, the air around them grew heavy, cold. The noise of the great hall seemed to fade into a distant buzz. As if pulled by a string, Arya turned. The Alpha King was no longer on his throne. He was walking down the steps. Each step was slow, deliberate, powerful. And he was walking, straight toward her.
The rumble became a roar. It consumed him. 10 years of silence, 10 years of iron-fisted control, 10 years of numb, empty peace, all of it shattered in a single heartbeat. His wolf, the beast he had starved and caged and tried to kill, was awake, and it wanted her. His mind screamed at him to stop, to sit down, to regain control. This was madness. A king did not act on impulse. A king did not show emotion. A king did not feel. But his body was no longer his own. He rose from his throne, the scrape of stone on stone lost in the sudden roaring silence of his own mind. He felt the shocked stares of his council, the confusion of the entire hall, but they were nothing, less than nothing. The only thing that was real was the girl in the shadows, and the primal, undeniable command echoing through his soul. Mine. He walked. He didn't remember deciding to move, but his feet carried him down the steps, across the stone floor, his eyes locked on her. The cruel sister and the pathetic beta heir froze, their mouths half open in shock. He ignored them. They were insects. He stopped before her, the broken, beautiful she-wolf with tears on her face. He could smell her grief, her defiance, her pain, and beneath it all, something else. Something that called to the very marrow of his bones. The world held its breath. He leaned down, his voice not his own, but the low, guttural rumble of the beast he had so long denied. "You are not unchosen," he growled, the words a vow, a claim, a verdict. "You are mine." The silence that followed was so absolute, so profound. It was a sound all its own. The monster was finally awake, and it had just chosen its mate. The words were out. He had said them, and the silence that followed was a living thing, a monster that devoured every sound in the great hall. In that moment, he felt a terrifying split. The king, the cold, logical ruler he had built himself to be, was screaming in a cage of his own ribs, clawing for control. But the wolf was roaring in triumph. It had tasted freedom for the first time in a decade, and it would not be chained again. Hundreds of eyes were on him, wide with shock, fear, and disbelief. He could feel their judgment like a physical weight. He's mad. The king has lost his mind. To make things worse, his own councilmen were gaping at him, their faces pale. What he had just done was not just a breach of protocol. It was an act of war against his own laws, the laws he had bled to create, and he had done it for her. The girl, his mate, was staring at him, her eyes vast pools of terror. She wasn't looking at him like a savior. No. She was looking at him like he was her executioner. Deep down, he knew the truth. Maybe he was. Before he could move, before his logical mind could wrestle back control and try to undo this catastrophic mess, his body moved on instinct. The wolf was in command now. He stepped forward, the space between them crackling with an energy no one else could see but everyone could feel. He held out his hand. It wasn't a request. It was a command. "Come," he said, and his voice was a low growl that carried through the dead, silent hall. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, he thought she might run. He saw it in the frantic darting of her eyes, the tremble in her limbs. On the other hand, where would she go? He had just claimed her in front of the entire world. There was no running from him now. With a shudder that shook her whole body, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of pure, white-hot energy shot up his arm, straight to the heart of the wolf. It was a feeling of rightness, of coming home. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever felt. Without another word, he turned and began to walk, pulling her with him. The crowd parted before them like a frightened sea, their whispers hissing in his wake. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Because if he did, the king might see the ruin he had just made of his perfectly ordered kingdom.
His voice, and it wasn't just a sound she heard with her ears. It was a rumble she felt deep in her bones, a vibration that shook her to her very soul. "You are mine." The world tilted. Time stood still. No, no, no. This was a nightmare, a cruel, twisted joke. Her thoughts spun in a dizzying circle of terror. The Alpha King didn't do this. He was the Ice King, a wolf who hadn't felt an emotion in years. Everyone knew the stories of the great tragedy that had frozen his heart. He made political alliances, not passionate claims in the middle of a ceremony. What had she done to deserve this? Was this a punishment for crying? For being weak? She didn't know what scared her more, the hundreds of eyes suddenly locked on her or the two burning gold ones that saw straight through her skin. The pity she had endured all night was gone. Instead, there was fear, suspicion. She saw it on every face. She was no longer the rejected girl. She was the king's madness. Then she saw Lyra. Her sister's face, which had been alight with triumph moments before, was now a mask of pure, murderous rage. The hatred in her eyes was so potent, so absolute, it was a physical blow. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and Arya knew her life was over in more ways than one. Before she could move, the king held out his hand. It was a command from a god, and she was just a mortal. Her body moved on instinct, her trembling hand rising to meet his. The moment they touched, fire bloomed beneath her skin. A shocking, possessive warmth that traveled up her arm and straight into her chest. It wasn't a comforting warmth. It was a brand, a claim. Her wolf, which had been whimpering in a corner of her soul all night, stirred and answered with a silent howl of its own. He pulled her forward, and she stumbled after him. The walk through the great hall was the longest of her life. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. They were a spectacle, a king and his captive. She kept her eyes on the floor, unable to bear the weight of their stares. Eventually, they were outside in the cold night air, the scent of rain and damp earth filling her lungs. Guards opened the door to a massive black carriage emblazoned with the royal crest, a snarling silver wolf. He guided her inside, his touch firm, inescapable, and then the door slammed shut, plunging them into an intimate, suffocating darkness. She was trapped with him.
The darkness inside the carriage was a relief. At the same time, it was a new kind of prison. The space was too small, and her scent, rain-washed flowers and pure, undiluted fear, was everywhere. It filled his lungs, clouding his thoughts. The wolf inside him settled, a low purr rumbling in his chest now that she was near, caged with him. But the king was finally regaining his footing, and the sheer scale of his recklessness crashed down on him. What had he done? He had thrown away a century of tradition, undermined his own authority, and declared to his enemies that he was ruled by impulse, that he was weak, all because of a primal pull toward a girl he didn't even know. She was huddled in the far corner of the velvet seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. He could hear her ragged breathing. Her terror was a living thing in the small space between them. Truth be told, he didn't know how to fix this. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, and the words sounded hollow, absurd. He was the most dangerous wolf on the continent, and he had just stolen her from her life. She flinched at the sound of his voice. "What? What do you want with me?" She whispered, her voice trembling. What did he want? The wolf wanted to claim her, to mark her, to lock her away in his mountain fortress, and never let anyone else look at her again. The king wanted to undo the last 10 minutes, to put the monster back in its cage and restore order. "There is a bond between us," he said, forcing the words out. They tasted like ash. An ancient connection. My wolf, it recognized you. More importantly, it had woken up for her. It was a pathetic explanation, the stuff of myth and legend that he had always dismissed as fairy tales for pups. But it was the only truth he had. "A bond?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "But that's impossible. You're the Alpha King." As if his title made him immune to such things. Maybe it should have. "What is your name?" he asked, changing the subject. Because if he had to keep talking about the bond, he might actually go mad. "Arya," she whispered. "Arya Vale." Arya. Her name hung in the air between them. The wolf liked the sound of it. Of course it did. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, a little stronger this time. "To my home, to the Icefang Citadel." He had to take her there because it was the most secure fortress in the kingdom. As a result, it was the only place he could be sure she, and his catastrophic secret, would be safe. The carriage lurched forward, its wheels finding purchase on the slick cobblestones, which meant there was no going back. He had made his claim. He had taken her. He had started a fire that would either warm his frozen kingdom or burn it to the ground. And as he looked at the silhouette of the terrified girl across from him, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a king of ice. He was the keeper of an ember, and he would kill anyone who tried to extinguish it.
The journey was a blur of darkness and fear, and the rocking of the carriage was the only thing that kept her grounded in reality. By the time they stopped, the moon was high and cold in a starless sky, and it was watching her. The carriage door swung open, and the first thing that hit her was the air. It was different here. Thin, sharp, and so cold it felt like breathing in powdered glass. And then she saw it. It wasn't a castle. It was a mountain that had been carved into the shape of a nightmare. The Icefang Citadel rose into the sky, a fortress of black stone and shimmering ice, its towers like daggers aimed at the heart of the moon. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so, a place of silent, absolute power. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb. Without a word, the king stepped out, his presence somehow larger, more dangerous in the biting wind. He turned and looked at her, his golden eyes glowing in the dark. He didn't offer his hand this time. Instead, he just waited, a silent command. Follow. And she did. What choice did she have? Inside, the citadel was even colder. Her footsteps echoed in the massive, cavernous hall, the sound swallowed by the shadows that danced between colossal stone pillars. A stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun met them, her eyes flickering to Arya with a mixture of curiosity and fear before she bowed low to the king. "See that she has everything she needs, Alara," Lucian commanded, his voice bouncing off the stone. "She is to be housed in the Queen's wing." The Queen's wing. The words felt like a mockery. Alara led her through endless, whispering corridors, her face a mask of cold professionalism. The rooms she was shown were breathtaking, larger than her entire family's home. A fire roared in a massive fireplace, a bed was draped in silks the color of cream, and jewels glittered from a vanity table. It was a cage, but it was a gilded one. Eventually, Alara left her alone in the crushing, opulent silence. She walked to a towering mirror and stared at her reflection. She saw a girl with wild eyes and a torn dress, a ghost haunting a palace. She didn't belong here. She was a prisoner. Later, she didn't know how much later, she heard voices from the hallway, low and rushed. "The king's curse," one maid whispered. "Hush! Do you want the king to hear you?" The other hissed back. "He hasn't been right since the great tragedy. His wolf has been silent for 10 years, until she arrived." Her breath caught in her throat. His wolf? Silent? A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. What kind of monster had she been chained to? A king with no soul, no wolf, no heart. And somehow, she was the one who had woken the beast. The thought was so terrifying she had to grip the vanity to keep from falling.
Silence, control, order. These were the pillars of his life, the very foundation of his rule. And now, they were gone. He sat in his solar, a glass of amber liquid untouched on his desk. He was trying to focus on the trade ledgers in front of him, but the ink swam before his eyes. Because all he could feel, all he could sense was her. She was on the other side of the citadel, yet it felt like she was breathing in the same room. The wolf, his wolf, paced restlessly at the back of his mind. It was no longer a distant rumble. It was a living, breathing presence, and it was demanding. Go to her. See her. Make sure she is safe. It was infuriating. It was maddening. This feeling, this constant pulling distraction, it was a weakness he could not afford. That's why he had to contain it. He summoned Ilara, his voice sharp. "The Lady Arya," he began, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She is to be treated as a guest of the highest honor. She will have anything she desires, food, clothes, books. But she is not to leave the Queen's wing, under any circumstances. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Ilara said, bowing, her face unreadable. He was putting his mate in a cage to keep his own beast from breaking out of its own. It was logical. It was necessary. So why did it feel so damn wrong? To make things worse, his council demanded an audience. He knew what they wanted before they even spoke. Lord Valerius, an old wolf whose family had served the throne for generations, stepped forward as their spokesman. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice a low, respectful growl. "The packs are unsettled. The events of the ceremony, your claim, it was an emotional display. The laws of arranged bonds exist for a reason, to maintain stability, to prevent weakness from seeping into the bloodlines." Lucian's jaw tightened. "Get to the point, Valerius." Valerius took a deep breath. "You must set the girl aside, publicly, form a proper alliance with the Stonecrest pack. Their alpha has a daughter of marrying age. It is the only way to calm the whispers of your instability." A low, guttural snarl ripped through the room before he could stop it. It wasn't his voice. It was the wolf's. Valerius and the other councilmen took a step back, their eyes wide with fear. The air thickened. The primal power that rolled off of Lucian was suffocating. He rose slowly from his chair, his hands flat on the desk to keep from lunging across it. "Arya Vale is mine," he snarled, his voice a terrifying blend of king and beast. "Her fate is for me to decide, and you will never speak of her as a weakness again. Now get out." They practically fled the room. He stood there, his chest heaving, the raw, untamed fury shaking him to his core. He had just defended her. He had just chosen her over the stability of his own kingdom. What in the hell was happening to him? Just as his breathing began to even out, a guard entered looking nervous. "Your Majesty, a visitor has arrived at the gates. She is insistent." Lucian's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Lady Lyra Vale," the guard said, and his blood ran cold. "She demands to see her sister."
The knock on her door made her jump. It was Alara, her expression as stony as ever. "You have a visitor, my lady." A visitor? Hope, small and fragile, fluttered in her chest. Had her pack sent someone for her? Was Kale here to— "Lady Lyra is waiting for you in the winter sitting room," Alara said, and the fragile Hope shattered into a million pieces of ice. "Lyra, here. No." The winter sitting room was as cold as its name. Everything was white and silver, beautiful and lifeless, like a room carved from a glacier. And in the center of it all, perched on a silk settee, was Lyra. She looked perfectly at home, a venomous flower blooming in the snow. "Sister," Lyra said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I had to come. I was so worried about you being dragged away like that. Are you all right? Is he treating you well?" The questions sounded like concern, but they were scalpels, meant to probe and cut. Arya's goal was simple: survive. Don't let her see you cry. "I am fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Lyra laughed, a light tinkling sound that made Arya's skin crawl. "Oh, Arya, you're a terrible liar, but I suppose I can't blame you. This must be terrifying." She gestured around the room. "It's a beautiful cage, I'll give him that. But a cage is still a cage." She stood and began to circle Arya like a predator. "Tell me, does he let you walk in the gardens? Or does he keep his new pet on a very short leash?" "He is the king," Arya managed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "He is a monster," Lyra corrected, her voice dropping to a hiss. "A cold, empty thing that hasn't had a feeling in a decade. And you are a momentary distraction, a curiosity." She stopped in front of Arya, her eyes hard as diamonds. "Do you really think this will last? He'll grow tired of you, just like Kale did. It's what you were born for, little sister, to be set aside." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, the old shame, the familiar feeling of worthlessness washing over her. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Lyra smiled, a slow, triumphant curve of her lips. She had won again. "Enjoy the castle while you can," she purred, turning and sweeping from the room, leaving Arya shaking in the frozen silence. But the silence didn't last. In the quiet that followed, she felt it. A presence. The air grew heavy, charged with a dangerous energy. Her head snapped up, her eyes drawn to the arched doorway where Lyra had just disappeared. He was there. Lucian, standing like a statue carved from shadow and rage, his golden eyes blazing with a light that was anything but cold. And she had the most terrifying thought of all. How much did he hear?
He stood in the doorway, a storm trapped in the shape of a man. The scent of Lyra's poisonous perfume still lingered in the air, an insult to his senses. But his eyes were on Arya. She was trembling, her face pale, her spirit looking as fragile as a frozen leaf. And the wolf inside him, the one she had woken, raged. It raged at Lyra for daring to touch what was his. It raged at the universe for making this girl the key to his soul. And it raged at him, at Lucian the king, for his weakness. Without another word, he strode into the room, his boots echoing like hammer blows on the marble floor. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He stopped in front of her, so close he could feel the frantic beat of her pulse. "You will not allow her to speak to you that way," he said, and his voice was not a comfort, it was a command. Cold, hard. "Ever again." Arya flinched, her eyes wide with a confusion that only fueled his fury. Didn't she understand? Her weakness was a target on his back, Her pain was a weapon his enemies could use against him. She is my sister, Arya stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She is a viper, he snarled, his control fraying. And this citadel is a nest of them. If you show them fear, they will bite, and their venom will be my problem. Before he could stop himself, his frustration boiled over. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard, intending to shake some sense into her to make her understand the danger. You are mine now. Your weakness is a reflection on me. Do you understand? He was trying to teach her to fight, to survive in this brutal world he had dragged her into. But all he knew was the language of power and control, because kindness had been burned out of him long ago. The moment his fingers wrapped around her arm, it happened. Fire. A bolt of pure, untamed energy surged between them, a jolt so powerful it was like lightning trapped under the skin. His breath hitched. Her gasp was a sharp, wounded sound. The air thickened, crackling with a power that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with their bond. His grip, which had been meant to intimidate, suddenly felt like an anchor. He couldn't let go. He wouldn't let go. The wolf purred, a deep, possessive rumble in his chest. Mate. In the stunning, ringing silence, he looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up to her terrified, beautiful face. Her lips were parted in a silent "oh" of shock. What had he done? This was not control. This was chaos. And as the bond pulsed between them, hot and undeniable, he realized something that terrified him more than any rebellion. He didn't want to let her go. Ever.
She fled. The moment he released her arm and stalked from the room, leaving her with the ghost of that fiery touch burning on her skin, she ran. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, from Lyra's cruelty, from Lucian's terrifying anger, from that feeling. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. It was like his brand was now on her soul. She didn't know where she was going. Her feet carried her through the cold, silent corridors of the citadel, past stern-faced guards who averted their eyes and tapestries that depicted ancient, bloody battles. This whole place was a monument to death and control. It suffocated her. She needed to breathe. She needed to find one single place that felt alive. As if pulled by a string, she found herself in a part of the castle she hadn't seen before. Down a long, forgotten hallway, she noticed a door made of dark wood and frosted glass, and from it, she felt warmth. A faint, impossible warmth. Hesitantly, she pushed it open, and her breath caught. She stepped out of the cold stone and into a world of vibrant, impossible life. It was a massive greenhouse, a hidden jungle locked away under a cathedral of glass. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth, night-blooming jasmine, and life. Water trickled from a small stone fountain in the center. Greenery cascaded from the walls. It was a secret garden, a sanctuary. Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back finally fell, silent trails on her cold cheeks. She sank onto a stone bench near the fountain, the sounds of dripping water a balm on her frayed nerves. Maybe it was fate that led her here. Here she wasn't the rejected girl or the king's prisoner. She was just Arya. "It was my mother's," a low voice said from the doorway. She gasped, her head snapping up. Lucian stood there, not as a king or a storm, but as a shadow watching her from the edge of the light. He didn't move to enter, as if he knew his presence would shatter the peace of this place. She was the only one who could make things grow in this frozen rock, he continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He took a hesitant step inside. She said it was the only place in the citadel that remembered what the sun felt like. In the quiet that followed, the tension from their earlier confrontation slowly dissolved, replaced by a fragile, tentative truce. I'm sorry, she whispered, not sure what she was apologizing for. For being weak? For existing? He finally moved closer, stopping a few feet from her bench. "What did she say to you? Before I arrived?" The question was direct, yet it lacked the harshness from before. She looked into his golden eyes and saw, for the first time, not a monster, but a wolf haunted by a deep, profound loneliness. And her own heart ached in recognition. "She told me that I was a temporary distraction," Arya admitted, her voice trembling, "that you would grow tired of me, and that I was born to be set aside." Something dark and dangerous flickered in his eyes, but his voice remained steady. "She was wrong." "How do you know?" The question was a raw plea. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the trickling of the fountain. "Because," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "my wolf, the part of me that feels, that connects, it has been silent for 10 years. Dead. I thought it was gone forever." He looked at her, and the weight of his stare was immense. "Until the moment I saw you crying in the shadows. Your pain. It was like a thunderclap that woke the dead." Her world tilted. He was giving her a piece of his broken soul. It was the most precious, terrifying gift she had ever received. Without thinking, as if her hand had a mind of its own, she reached out. Not to touch him, but just a gesture, an offering of comfort. He took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers. And then he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He reached out and gently, so gently, tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her cheek, the touch as soft as a moth's wing, yet it set her entire nervous system on fire. It was an act of such simple, profound intimacy that it left her breathless. The King of Ice and Shadow had just shown her that he too could remember the sun.
He left the greenhouse with his heart hammering against his ribs. What was that? That tenderness. He had given her a truth he hadn't spoken aloud to another living soul, and her reaction, that flicker of understanding, of empathy, had terrified him more than any army. He had let her see the crack in his armor. That gentle moment, the feel of her soft skin under his fingers, had shaken him to his very foundation. He strode through the halls, his mind a whirlwind. He needed to regain control, to put the ice back in his veins. Duty. That was the answer. He would lose himself in the running of his kingdom, because that was a world he understood. He found Lord Gregor, his spy master, waiting for him in his solar, and the look on the old wolf's face was grim. "Your Majesty," Gregor said, his voice low, "the whispers have become a plan." Lucien's blood ran cold. "Explain." "Lady Lyra and the beta heir, Kale, are not just spreading dissent. They have been meeting in secret with the alphas of the Blood Moon and Stonefang packs," Gregor reported, his words clipped and precise. "They are forming a coalition. They are using your connection to the Lady Arya as their rallying cry." "What are they saying?" Lucien demanded, his voice a low growl. Gregor hesitated. "They are saying the king's mind is compromised, that an emotional attachment has made you unstable, unfit to rule. They are twisting our laws, claiming your fated bond is a curse, not a blessing. They are planning to challenge your right to the throne at the next full moon." The fragile warmth from the greenhouse vanished, replaced by a rage so cold it felt like ice flooding his veins. They were using her. They were taking this pure, impossible thing that had woken him from a decade of sleep and twisting it into a weapon aimed at his heart and at his crown. For 10 years he had ruled with logic and fear. He had made himself into a monster to keep his kingdom safe. But now, they were threatening the one thing, the one person, who made him feel like a wolf again. In that moment, a decision crystallized in his mind, sharp and clear as a shard of ice. He had been hiding her, trying to protect his weakness. But that was Lyra's game, a game of shadows and whispers. He would not play it. Instead, he would do the one thing they would never expect. He would not hide his weakness. He would put her on a throne, and dare them to challenge him. He turned to his aide, who stood waiting by the door. "Merrick," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent for too long. "Prepare the Great Hall for a formal dinner tonight. Send invitations to every visiting lord and lady." He paused, his golden eyes blazing. "The Lady Arya will be attending, at my side." Which meant the game was no longer being played in the shadows. It was about to be played in the light, for the entire world to see.
The gowns arrived like a death sentence. Alara and 2 other maids entered her chambers, their arms laden with silks and velvets in the deep, intimidating colors of the royal house: charcoal gray, blood red, and silver. They laid them out on her bed, a shimmering funeral pyre for the girl she used to be. "The king requests your presence at a formal dinner tonight," Alara announced, her voice flat, betraying nothing. "He wishes for you to be dressed as befits your station." Her station? A prisoner? A pet? A weakness? The words from the council, from Lyra, from Lucian himself, swirled in her head. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. I can't," she whispered, shaking her head as she backed away. "I can't go out there. They all hate me." Alara's expression softened for the first time, a flicker of something that might have been pity. "It is not a request, my lady." No, it was a command. He was forcing her out into the light, into the nest of vipers he'd warned her about. Deep down, she knew the truth. He was testing her, and she was going to fail. But then she remembered the greenhouse. She remembered the look in his eyes when he spoke of his silent wolf, the impossible softness of his fingers against her cheek. He hadn't just seen her pain. He had shown her his. And something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about his. "The red one," she said, her voice small but steady. If she was going to be a sacrifice, she would at least look like a flame. An hour later, she was a stranger in her own skin. The blood-red silk gown felt like armor, and the silver necklace around her throat felt like a collar. When Lucian arrived at her door to escort her, he stopped dead. He said nothing, but his golden eyes burned with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. Without a word, he offered her his arm. His touch was electric, a jolt of raw power that traveled straight to her core. And she let it happen. She let it steady her. With every step they took down the long corridor toward the great hall, her terror grew. The distant murmur of voices grew louder, a beast waiting to devour her. But as they reached the massive doors, she felt his hand tighten on hers. It was all the reassurance she would get. The doors swung open. And the world went silent. Every lord and lady in the hall turned, their conversations dying on their lips. The silence was a physical blow, a wall of judgment and hatred. She could feel their stares like 1,000 tiny needles. Her first instinct was to look down, to hide. But then she felt Lucian's presence beside her, a mountain of unyielding strength. "Your weakness is a reflection on me. No, not tonight." She lifted her chin. She looked out at the sea of hostile faces, at the calculating eyes of Lord Valerius, at the pure, venomous shock on her sister's face. And she did not look away. In that moment, she wasn't just Arya Vale, the rejected girl. She was the woman who stood beside the Alpha King, and she would not be broken.
He felt her fear as if it were his own, a frantic bird beating its wings against his ribs. Yet when the doors opened and the silence fell, he felt something else from her too, a flicker of steel, a spark of defiance. When her chin lifted, a fierce, possessive pride surged through him, so potent it nearly brought a growl to his lips. This was his mate. They walked to the high table, every step a calculated act of war. He seated her in the chair beside his, the one that had remained empty for a decade. The message was unmistakable. The whispers started then, a venomous hiss that slithered through the hall. He ignored them. Let them talk. Let them plot. Tonight, they would learn what real power was. The dinner was an agonizing play of false smiles and veiled insults. He could feel the tension coiling in the room, tighter and tighter with every passing moment, and he knew it was about to snap. Eventually, Lord Malachi of the Stonefang Pack, one of Lyra's new allies, rose to his feet, a goblet of wine in his hand. "A toast," he said, his voice loud enough to command the room's attention. "To the king." The wolves all drank, but Malachi wasn't finished. "And to the laws that have kept our kingdom strong," he continued, his eyes fixed on Lucian. "Laws that value strength and stability above passing fancies." The insult was clear. The challenge had been made. The air thickened and the room held its breath. The wolf inside Lucien wanted to cross the room and tear the man's throat out. But the king had a better idea. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. He did not look at Malachi. Instead, he looked at Arya. "Lord Malachi speaks of strength," Lucien said, his voice a low, dangerous calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. "For 10 years, I have ruled this kingdom with a strength born of ice, a strength born of control, a strength born of an empty heart." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I was wrong." Then, he reached out and placed his hand on Arya's shoulder. He let the bond flare. He didn't just let them see it. He let them feel it. A wave of raw, untamed, possessive power washed through the hall. It was the scent of lightning, the heat of a forest fire, the sound of a god's own heartbeat. It was ancient and primal, a force that shook every wolf in the room to their very core. The goblets in their hands trembled. The ladies paled. The lords bared their teeth in instinctive submission. "This is not a passing fancy," Lucien growled, his golden eyes blazing as he looked out at the stunned crowd. "This is not a weakness. This is a fated bond. This is the magic that forged our people. It is a strength you have all forgotten." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a possessive whisper for all to hear as he looked at Arya. "And she is the heart of it." He sat down, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. But he had just won the war. Or so he thought. Because when his eyes met Lyra's across the room, he saw no fear. He saw a hatred so deep, so absolute, it promised a much bloodier battle to come.
After the dinner, the silence in his private solar was louder than the roaring in her ears. The adrenaline from the great hall had faded, leaving behind a raw, quivering exhaustion. He had defended her. He hadn't just claimed her. He had declared her the source of his new strength. Her heart ached with a terrifying, beautiful emotion she couldn't name. He stood by the fire, his back to her, one hand braced against the stone mantelpiece. The rigid control was back, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. The performance was over, and the man was left. "Why?" she whispered into the quiet. He didn't turn. They needed to understand. "No," she said, taking a step closer. "Not that. Why was your wolf silent?" She had to know. She had to understand the man who had just overturned his world for her. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with a pain so old it sounded like grinding stone. "Because I killed it," he said. "Or I tried to." He turned then, and in the flickering firelight, she saw the ghost of a younger wolf in his eyes, one haunted by a grief that had never healed. "Years ago, before I was king, I was different. I felt things too much. Love, passion, rage." He told her the story of the great tragedy. He spoke of a forbidden love with a rival alpha's daughter, of a secret meeting, of a moment of passionate carelessness that had led his family's enemies right to their door. He spoke of the ambush, of the fire, of finding his parents' bodies in the smoldering ruins of their home. "My emotion killed them," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. A single, perfect tear escaped his eye, not of sadness, but of a decade of pure, undiluted rage at himself. So I made a vow on their ashes. I would never be weak again. I would cut out my own heart, starve my own wolf, and become the king of ice and stone they needed. Her chest ached, a mirror of his own pain. This was the source of his cruelty, his control, his loneliness. It was all a shield. Without thinking, her body moved on instinct. She crossed the space between them and, before he could pull away, she gently placed her hand over his heart. She could feel its frantic, unsteady beat beneath her palm. "You are not made of stone," she whispered. His breath hitched. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then up at her face, his golden eyes searching hers. The air thickened, the space between them burning with all the things that had not been said. The fear, the triumph, the shared, aching grief. And then he was moving. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek as he leaned in. His lips crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a raw, desperate collision. It was a decade of starvation and a lifetime of loneliness poured into one searing, searching touch. It was the king of ice claiming his flame not with a command but with a plea. It tasted of ashes and whiskey and a desperate, impossible hope. And as she kissed him back, pouring all of her own broken pieces into him, she knew this was the true point of no return. For a week, the world was a fragile, beautiful dream. After that night, after that kiss, something had thawed in the citadel, and in him. The whispers in the corridors hadn't stopped, but now they were laced with fear and awe instead of just scorn. Lucian didn't hide her away. Instead, he kept her close. They ate meals together, walked the castle ramparts under the cold stars, and sat in silence by the fire in his solar. He never spoke of his past again, and he never touched her with that desperate fire again. But the way he looked at her was a constant, smoldering touch. For the first time since her heart had been shattered, she felt hope. A dangerous, terrifying, wonderful hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't born to be set aside. Today was the grand tournament, a celebration of the autumn hunt. Bright banners snapped in the wind, the air smelled of roasted boar and spiced wine, and the sounds of laughter and cheers echoed across the training grounds. She sat in the royal viewing box, a fine wool cloak in the king's silver and gray wrapped around her shoulders. Lucian stood beside her, a king in his element, powerful and relaxed. What followed was a moment so perfect, so simple. She ached with it. He leaned down, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Are you warm enough?" Before she could answer, a commotion erupted below. A man screamed, a choked, strangled sound. The crowd gasped, stumbling back. Lord Theron, the powerful alpha of the Silver Creek Pack and one of Lucian's oldest, most loyal allies, was on the ground. He was convulsing, his face turning a horrifying shade of blue, a silver goblet fallen from his hand. Chaos, shouts, guards running, panic spreading like wildfire through the festive crowd. Arya's heart leapt into her throat. She stood, her hands gripping the railing, her eyes wide with horror. Beside her, Lucian was no longer a relaxed wolf. He was a king of ice and steel, his eyes narrowed, his entire body radiating cold, lethal authority. But then, a voice, sharp with practiced alarm, cut through the noise. "The goblet!" It was Lyra. She pushed through the panicked crowd, Kale at her side, her face a perfect mask of concern. She knelt beside the dying lord, her fingers hovering over the cup. "There's something in it. It smells of wolf's bane." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Wolf's bane. A poison so rare, so potent, it could kill an alpha in seconds. "Where would someone even get such a thing?" Kyle asked loudly, playing his part perfectly. Lyra stood, her eyes sweeping the crowd before landing, with pinpoint, devastating accuracy on Arya. Her expression was one of dawning, sorrowful realization. "The king's greenhouse," Lyra said, her voice trembling with false grief. "It's the only place in the kingdom the plant is cultivated, for medicinal use." She looked directly at Arya, and in the span of a breath, she sealed her fate. "The Lady Arya's private garden?" The world went silent. Every eye in the courtyard, hundreds of them, turned to her. The warmth of their recent acceptance was gone, replaced by a cold, horrified suspicion. Her hope, her fragile, beautiful dream, it was turning into a nightmare. "She was jealous," a voice whispered from the crowd. "Lord Theron advised the king against the bond. She wanted to remove a rival for his affection," another added. The whispers grew into a roar of accusation. Her head spun. No, no, this wasn't happening. Her eyes flew to Lucien, pleading with him, begging him to see the truth. But his face was a mask of stone, unreadable, his golden eyes dark with a terrifying ancient pain. And then, the guards started moving. Not to control the crowd. No, they were moving toward her.
Rage. It was a clean, cold, surgical thing. The moment he saw Theron fall, his mind was already working, calculating, assessing threats. His first instinct was to shield Arya, to get her away from the chaos. But then Lyra's voice cut through the air, and he knew. This was not a random attack. This was a move in the game, and it was a masterstroke. He watched her play her part, the concerned sister, the brilliant strategist, the greenhouse. Of course, she had used his mother's sanctuary, Arya's only place of peace, and turned it into a weapon. He had shown Arya to the court as a strength, and Lyra, with one move, had twisted her into a murderer. He saw the fear on Arya's face, her desperate, silent plea, and it was like a knife twisting in his gut. The wolf inside him screamed, a raw, savage, unending howl. Protect her, kill them all, burn this kingdom to the ground for her. But the king remembered a different fire. He remembered the smell of burning wood and the sight of his parents' bodies. He remembered the cost of a single emotional mistake, and the ghosts of his past rose up, their cold hands gripping his heart. The whispers from the crowd were not just accusations against Arya, they were accusations against him. Your emotion has made you weak. Your bond has brought death. You failed to protect us, just like before. His council surrounded him, their faces grim. Your Majesty, Lord Valerius said, his voice low and urgent. You see now. The girl is a cancer. The Pax will not stand for this. They will see this as a sign of your weakness, an inability to control your mate. There will be war. She is innocent, Lucien growled, the words ripping from his throat. It doesn't matter, Valerius shot back. The evidence is perfect. If you defend her now, you lose the throne. You lose everything. You will be seen as a king ruled by a murderous consort. And there it was. The impossible choice. His deepest, most terrifying fear made real. The woman who was his soul, or the kingdom he had sworn on his parents' graves to protect. His wolf screamed mate, his duty screamed kingdom. The two halves of himself were tearing him apart. He looked at Arya, standing alone in the viewing box, the entire world turning against her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw that flicker of steel he had come to recognize. He had to make a choice, not as a wolf, not as a man, but as a king. He turned to his royal guard, his face a mask of cold, unforgiving ice. He let the silence stretch, letting the entire world hang on his next word. He let Arya see him, the Ice King she had heard stories about, reborn in this moment of crisis. And then he spoke, his voice void of all emotion, a command that was a death sentence. Confine her, he said, the words tasting like ash and blood. To the dungeons. He watched the hope in her eyes shatter. He watched her face crumble as the guards took her arms. He watched as they dragged his soul away from him. And he stood there, a king of stone, as the monster he had tried so hard to kill finally, Truly, one.
The darkness was absolute. It was a cold, wet, living thing that pressed in on her from all sides. The dungeon smelled of mildew and old stone and 1,000 years of forgotten despair. A steady drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere in the blackness was the only sound. A relentless torture counting down the seconds of her new reality. They had thrown her in here. Not even in a cell with a barred door, but in a pit. A hole in the ground with a grate for a ceiling. Confine her. The word echoed in the crushing silence. It wasn't just a command. It was a judgment. A betrayal so complete, so absolute, it had hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a raw, aching emptiness. The man who had kissed her with such desperate fire. The man who had called her the heart of his strength. The man who had woken her from her own long sleep. Had just thrown her into the dark. Her internal flaw, the ugly, twisted belief she had fought so hard against, rose up and screamed at her in the darkness. Lyra was right. Cale was right. You were born to be set aside. You are worthless. A temporary distraction. A curse. She curled into a ball on the damp stone floor, a sob tearing through her. A raw, ragged sound that the darkness swallowed whole. She cried for the life she had lost, for the hope that had been a lie, for the man who had saved her only to become her executioner. Her heart, which had just started to heal, was not just broken now. It was gone. There was nothing left. All was lost. She didn't know how long she lay there, adrift in a sea of her own despair. Minutes, hours. But then, something else began to stir in the emptiness. A flicker. It was not hope. Hope was a fool's game. A lie whispered in the light. No, this was something else. Something older and harder. Rage. A cold, quiet fury began to smolder in the pit of her stomach. The tear tracks on her face grew cold. Her sobs subsided. The dripping water was no longer a sound of torture. It was a sound of focus. She had been a victim her whole life. A victim of her sister's ambition. A victim of a broken promise. A victim of a lonely king's curse. She had let their choices define her, break her, and discard her. Not anymore. She sat up in the darkness, her spine straight. Her hands, which had been trembling, clenched into fists. They could put her in a pit. They could call her a murderer. He could break her heart. But she would not let them break her. Alone in the dark, she made a vow. Not to a king, or a mate, or a god. She made it to the last, stubborn, flickering ember of her own soul. I will not let you win, she whispered to the darkness, her voice no longer trembling, but shaking with the promise of a coming fire. I will not be set aside. And in the deepest, darkest pit of the Icefang Citadel, a queen was born.
The solar felt like a tomb. He sat on his throne-like chair, a glass of untouched wine in his hand, the perfect picture of a broken king. Lyra and Cale stood before him, vultures circling a fresh kill. He had summoned them, and they had come eagerly, their faces barely concealing their triumph. His goal was simple, deceptively so. He had to play the part they expected, the grieving mate, the compromised ruler, the fool who had chosen emotion and lost everything. Because only in his perceived weakness would they reveal the true extent of their ambition. You were right, Lucian said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. He let his gaze drift to the fire, as if he couldn't bear to look at them. The bond. It was a sickness. She has brought ruin to this court. Lyra's smile was a slow, poisonous bloom. I am so sorry, Your Majesty. She purred, the words dripping with false sympathy. I tried to warn you. Some wolves are just born to cause trouble. What do you want, Lyra? He asked, cutting through her performance with a tired sigh. Justice, Kyle said, stepping forward, his chest puffed out with a newfound arrogance. The Pax demand a trial, a public one. They must see that the king's law is absolute even when it touches his own heart. My heart? The wolf inside him snarled, a low, murderous sound that he ruthlessly suppressed. You know nothing of my heart." "A trial would be difficult," Lucian murmured, playing his part. "Painful, but necessary," Lyra insisted, her eyes glittering. "To restore faith, the court must see you set her aside, once and for all. They must see you choose your kingdom over her." And there it was, the core of their plan. They didn't just want Arya dead, they wanted him to be the one to kill her, emotionally and spiritually, in front of the entire world. They wanted to break him, to prove that his way, the way of the bond, was a path to ruin. "And after?" he asked, his voice flat. "After she is condemned?" Lyra stepped closer, her scent of cloying flowers filling the air. "The kingdom will need stability. A new queen. One chosen by logic, not some fleeting passion. The alliance with the Stonecrest pack is still an option, or a union between our two families could prove even stronger." So, that was the final move. She didn't just want Arya's place, she wanted the throne itself. Deep down, he knew the truth. Her ambition was a bottomless pit. He was silent for a long moment, letting the tension build. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the blood-red liquid cling to the crystal. Then, he looked up, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Very well," he said, the words tasting like ash. "There will be a public trial. Tomorrow at noon." He saw the flash of victory in their eyes, the shared, triumphant glance. They thought they had won. They were fools. "You may go." They practically floated from the room. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, the broken king vanished. The ice in his eyes began to burn. He rose from his chair, not with weariness but with the lethal grace of a predator. He strode to a section of the stone wall and pressed a hidden sigil. A panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. Without hesitation, he stepped into the shadows. He had let the vipers believe the lion was dead. Now, it was time to unleash the wolf.
Time in the darkness was a formless thing. She measured it in the slow, rhythmic drip of water, in the aching of her bones on the cold stone, in the steady, burning hum of her own quiet rage. She had moved past tears, past despair. She was something else now, something harder, something forged in betrayal and silence. Without warning, a sound broke the monotony, not the distant clang of a guard's boot, but a soft, scraping noise from the wall behind her. Her body went tense, a growl rising in her throat. She got to her feet, pressing herself against the opposite wall, her eyes straining in the pitch black. The scraping stopped. A moment later, a section of the damp stone wall shifted inward, revealing a sliver of flickering torchlight. A figure slipped through the opening, a tall, cloaked man holding a single torch. Her first instinct was to lunge, to fight. "My lady," the man whispered, his voice rough but respectful. He lowered his hood. It was Merrick, the captain of Lucian's personal guard, a wolf whose face was a roadmap of old scars. "I mean you no harm. I come on the king's orders." The king's orders? A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. Had he sent his executioner? "To finish the job?" she asked, her voice raspy. Marek's craggy face was grim. "No, my lady, to give you this." He held out a small, tightly rolled piece of parchment, tied with a single black thread. She stared at it, her heart a wild, frantic thing. What was this? Another trick? A final cruel twist of the knife? With trembling fingers, she took it. Her hands were clumsy in the dark, but she managed to break the thread and unroll the rough paper. In the flickering light of the torch, she saw a few lines of sharp, familiar handwriting. "The coldest steel is forged in the darkest fire. Be ready." That was it. Just one sentence. But it changed everything. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. It wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't an abandonment. It was a plan. A terrifying, high-stakes gamble. He hadn't thrown her to the wolves. He had thrown her into the furnace, trusting that she would come out as a blade. And the rage that had kept her warm in the darkness now sharpened into a weapon. Hope, not the soft, gentle thing she'd felt before, but a hard, dangerous, beautiful hope, exploded in her chest. "What does he want me to do?" she asked, her voice no longer the whisper of a victim, but the low, steady tone of a conspirator. "The trial is tomorrow at noon," Merrick said, his voice urgent. "Lady Lyra will present her case. The king wants her to. He needs her to feel completely safe, completely triumphant." He then told her a key piece of information, a detail about the poison that only the king's inner circle would know, a question that only the guilty party would be unable to answer correctly. "He needs you to be the one to set the trap. Can you do it?" Could she do it? Could she stand before the entire world and face her sister, not as a victim, but as a queen? She looked at the message in her hand, the words a silent promise between her and her king. "Tell him," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed, "that the steel is ready."
The air in the secret war room was thick with tension. He stood before the handful of wolves he trusted with his life. Marek, Gregor his spy master, and the alphas of 2 loyalist packs who had arrived under the cover of darkness. They had all believed the worst of him for the past 24 hours. They had all thought he'd sacrificed his mate. Now, they would learn the truth. "Lyra Vale believes she has won," Lucian began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed in the stone chamber. "She believes I am a broken man who will sacrifice his own mate to save his crown. She is about to learn how wrong she is." He laid out the plan, not a plan of defense, but of attack, a trap. "The trial will proceed," he explained, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "We will let Lyra present her perfectly crafted evidence. We will let her spin her tale of a jealous, murderous consort. We will let her convince the entire court of Araya's guilt." "Your Majesty, that is an incredible risk," Gregor warned, his brow furrowed. "If the court turns against her completely, then they will see what happens when a king's justice is absolute." Lucian finished, his voice dropping, promising violence. "Lyra will overplay her hand. Her arrogance is her weakness, and we will use it as a weapon. At the peak of her triumph, when she believes she has won everything, Arya will ask her a question that only the person who handled the wolf's bane could possibly answer." He explained the final piece of the puzzle, the surprise witness Marek had secured, a stable boy Lyra had paid to plant the evidence and then tried to have killed. He was alive, and he was waiting. "This trial is not for Araya," Lucian said, his gaze sweeping over his loyalists, locking them in his iron will. "It is for Lyra. It is her execution, and she is going to be the one to sharpen the axe." A grim understanding settled over the room. This was not the act of a broken king. This was the masterstroke of a predator who had lured his prey into the perfect ambush. He looked at the single window where the first gray hints of dawn were beginning to stain the sky. Soon. It would all be over soon. He had put his entire kingdom, his life, and the fate of his mate on a single, desperate gamble. Moments later, the heavy drums began to beat, a slow, somber rhythm that announced a royal trial was about to begin. It was time. He walked toward the doors of the chamber, his loyalists falling into step behind him. As he reached the exit, Merrick spoke. "She is strong, Your Majesty, stronger than any of them know." Lucian paused, his hand on the door, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable crossing his face. "I know," he said softly. "She is forging me, just as I am forging her." Then, he pushed the doors open and walked out to take his seat at the trial of the woman he loved. The stage was set. The trap was laid, and the whole world was watching.
The sound of the drums was a death march. Each beat vibrated through the stone floor, up through the soles of her simple leather shoes, and into her bones. Her bones remembered him, and the promises whispered in the dark of his dungeon. She walked between two guards, her hands bound in front of her not with iron, but with a silken cord, a mockery of her so-called station. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a sacrifice. The doors to the great hall swung open, and the sound of 100 wolves holding their breath hit her like a physical wave. She lifted her chin. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. The hall was packed, a sea of hostile, hungry faces. And on a raised platform sat her sister, Lyra, dressed in a gown of deep purple, the color of royalty she so desperately craved. Cale was beside her, looking pale and nervous. On the highest throne sat Lucien, a king of ice. His face was a mask of cold indifference, his golden eyes giving nothing away. But as her gaze met his across the vast, silent room, she felt it, etched in fire, a silent pulse of the bond between them. Be ready. She was ready. They led her to the center of the hall, a lone wolf surrounded by the pack. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Let the trial begin, Lucian's voice boomed, cold and final. Lyra rose, a picture of sorrowful duty. She began her performance, her voice ringing with false grief as she spoke of Lord Theron's tragic death. She presented the goblet, the traces of Wolf's bane clear for all to see. Then she presented a witness, a terrified-looking maid who swore she had seen Lady Arya near the greenhouse just before the tournament, her hands stained with dirt. It was a perfect, beautiful lie. The evidence is clear, Lyra said, her voice filled with crocodile tears as she turned to Lucian. This girl, driven by a jealous heart and a lust for power, has brought murder into our sacred court. She is a poison. Her eyes then fell on Arya, and for a moment, the mask slipped. Arya saw the pure, triumphant hatred beneath. She must be cleansed. A growl of agreement rumbled through the crowd. This was it, the peak of her sister's triumph. Does the accused have anything to say in her defense? Lucian asked, his voice a flat, empty thing. Arya took a deep breath, the scent of fear and sweat filling her lungs. This was her moment, her one and only shot. I do, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. She didn't look at Lucian. She looked directly at her sister. Lady Lyra, you seem to know a great deal about this poison. You identified it so quickly. Lyra's smile was condescending. I am well read, sister, unlike some. Then you must know, Arya continued, her voice like a blade of ice, that to prevent the wolf's bane from poisoning the handler, its leaves must be crushed with a silver pestle, not an iron one. Iron causes the toxins to neutralize. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. So tell me, sister, when you were preparing the poison, did you remember to use the silver?
The trap was sprung. He watched from his throne as the color drained from Lyra's face. The entire hall was silent, confused. They didn't understand the question, but Lyra did. In that single heartbeat, the world shifted. Her perfect plan, her flawless victory had just cracked. What is this nonsense? Lyra stammered, her composure finally breaking. Of course I wouldn't know such a thing. I am not a poisoner. Then how could you know the medicinal wolf's bane in the greenhouse hadn't been neutralized already? Arya pressed, her voice relentless. Because it is grown for study, it is always crushed with iron first to make it safe. The only way it could have been used to kill Lord Theron is if someone brought their own silver pestle to the greenhouse that day. A gasp went through the crowd. They were starting to see it. The beautiful lie was unraveling. This is absurd, Cale shouted, jumping to his feet. She is trying to confuse you. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Perhaps, Lucien said, his voice a low thunder that silenced all others. We should ask someone who was there. He raised a single hand. Bring in the witness. The great doors opened again, and Marek entered not alone, but with a young, terrified stable boy, his arm in a sling. The boy who was supposed to be dead. The moment Lyra saw him, she broke. her face contorted into a mask of pure, snarling rage. The performance was over. The monster was out. "You!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly sound. "You were supposed to be gone." Before anyone could move, before the guards could react, she lunged, not at the stable boy, not at Lucian, but at Arya. Her fingernails were like claws aimed at her sister's face. But she never made it. In the span of a breath, Lucian was no longer on his throne. He was a blur of silver and shadow, a silent storm of fury that moved faster than the eye could see. He appeared in front of Arya, a living shield of muscle and rage. He caught Lyra's wrist in a grip of iron, his golden eyes blazing with all the fury of the wolf he had suppressed for a decade. "You," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying promise of death that shook the very stones of the hall. "Will never touch her again." The power that rolled off of him was absolute, a primal wave of alpha dominance that forced every wolf in the room, lord, lady, and guard, to their knees. All but one. Behind him, Arya stood tall, her head held high, unbowed, unbroken. The trial was over. The aftermath was swift. The stable boy's testimony, combined with Lyra's own murderous confession, sealed the fate of the traitors. Kale and the other rebel lords were stripped of their titles and lands, their packs brought under the direct rule of the crown. They had gambled for power and lost everything. Now only Lyra remained, held between two guards, her face a mess of tears and snarling hatred. The court was silent, waiting for his judgment. The old Lucian, the Ice King, would have had her executed on the spot. It would have been just. It would have been easy. But he was not the old Lucian. He looked at Arya, who watched him, her expression not vengeful, but steady. She had won. She didn't need blood to prove it. "Lady Lyra Vale," he said, his voice calm and clear, "for your treason against the crown, and for the attempted murder of your sister, the Lady Arya, you are hereby stripped of your name and title. You will be exiled to the Wailing Peaks to live out your days alone, where your poison can harm no one but yourself." He paused. "It is a mercy you do not deserve, but my queen has taught me the value of it." A howl of rage was Lyra's only response as the guards dragged her away. He was a king, and a king must show strength, not just through fury, but through wisdom. And that was a lesson Arya had given him. As the hall began to empty, a new era began. He addressed his stunned court, his voice ringing with an authority they had never heard before. He spoke not of cold laws, but of the strength of fated bonds. He spoke of a new way forward, a kingdom built on trust and truth, not just fear and control. He was no longer just their king. He was their alpha, in every sense of the word. Finally, his duties were done. The lords were dismissed, the traitors dealt with, the kingdom secured, and only one thing remained. He turned and saw her standing there, a lone flame in the vast, empty hall. She hadn't moved. She had waited for him. He walked toward her, the sound of his boots the only sound in the world. He stopped before her, and for the first time he let her see everything in his eyes. The fear, the relief, the regret, and the overwhelming, all-consuming love. "Arya," he said, his voice rough. And that was all he could manage.
Her name hung in the air between them, a promise. He stood before her not as the Ice King or the roaring Alpha, but as Lucian, the wolf with the haunted eyes and the broken heart that she had somehow helped mend. The hall was empty now, the shadows long and peaceful. Her fury was gone, her fear was gone. In their place was a quiet, profound sense of rightness. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. "You called me your queen," she whispered, the words both a question and a statement. "I did," he said, his voice soft. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray curl from her face, his touch sending a warm shiver through her. "I was hoping you would not object." A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, truly happy smile she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. "I am not the girl they chose for you, Lucian." "No," he agreed, his golden eyes impossibly soft. "You are not the girl they chose. You are the wolf my soul chose." He took her hands in his grip warm and steady. "I have been a king of a silent, empty kingdom for 10 years, Arya. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life." Her chest ached with the beautiful, overwhelming truth of it all. She was not a weakness. She was his strength. Her worth was not something given to her by a mate or a title. It was the fire inside her that had refused to be extinguished even in the deepest dark. "Stand by my side, Arya," he murmured, his voice a low, heartfelt plea. "Not as my possession, not as a symbol, but as my partner, my equal, my queen." She looked into the eyes of the wolf who had saved her, the king she had saved right back, and she gave him her answer. "Yes," she said. And as he lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss not of desperation or fire, but of a deep and endless peace, she knew she was finally home. The rejected girl had become a queen. The Ice King had found his flame. And in the heart of the cold stone citadel, a new, warmer, and far stronger kingdom was born.